Well, my name is Sebastian Bostwick, and I'm an MFA candidate in poetry here at University of Notre Dame. And I'm joined with the wonderful Oliver Baez, who I will be interviewing today for the Institute for Latino Studies Oral History Project. Today's date is November 7th. It is in 2019. It's around 2:30 p.m. And we're currently in the Scholars Lounge in Bond Hall in the University of Notre Dame's campus in South Bend, Indiana. So I already mentioned this, but we kind of just start off like a background information, like where and when you were born, any family history, significant childhood memories, moments that inspired you to pursue writing, things like that, so you can get a little sketch of who you are as a person and a poet.
Sure.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot.
Okay, yeah, let me see here. I'll start with some basics, which I'm pretty sure to be true. I was born in Iowa City, Iowa on June 21st, 1987. Gemini Cancer cusp, for the record.
Love that.
And let's see. I lived in Iowa City until my 21st birthday. My father grew up in Iowa, and my mother grew up in Chicago, and then had gone a few hours west to the University of Iowa, which is where they met. And they met on the first day of freshman writing at the University of Iowa. I have one older sister, and my favorite chore was taking out the compost. My parents always had a big garden, and I would take out the compost, which we kept in like an old, gallon ice cream container. And I hated that part because it was, it smelled but I liked staying out there and just gorging myself on raspberries from the garden. So I'd be like, take out the compost and then half an hour later.
Still be out there.
Yeah, I drew a lot. I was very obsessed with song lyrics. And as soon as the internet came around, I would look up song lyrics for songs that I had heard on the radio or things like that and print them out and just carry them with me everywhere and memorize them. Looking back now, I can see the ways that like lyrics were a portal to poetry for me because at some point the music part of it sort of dropped off and I started writing my own song lyrics that just sort of, I can track it to poetry, even though at the
Mm,
time I was like, these are song
mm.
lyrics. We always had dogs. There were some fish and lizards around. And my father's family was part of the Amana colonies in Iowa, which was a communal living situation that was one of the longest lasting and one of the largest in the United States. And they were communal from about 1855 to around 1930
Oh, wow.
in Iowa. And that was a group that had started in Germany, although it also included some French and some others, and they were a group of mystics, and they were persecuted in Germany because they wanted to homeschool their kids and were, conscientious objectors and all of these things and didn't believe in signing oaths. So they came here. And my mother's father grew up in Puerto Rico, was born there. He now lives in Florida. And my mother's mother is was Southern Italian, and her family fled Italy during Mussolini and went first to Montreal and then to Chicago. So that's some family history. That's some childhood memories, some pet information. If there's anything else, feel free to ask. One or others.
Yeah, and you touched on what kind of led you to poetry. Well, I wanted to ask about that actually. So you would write your own lyrics. Did you play instruments at all, or was it just you kind of were just like, oh, this is will be set to music eventually?
I did play instruments at a certain point. So I played trumpet for 1 year in the school band, and my parents had the foresight to only rent the instrument. And then I played guitar. My dad had a guitar and he taught me some things. And so that was really when it was like, I am writing song lyrics to be played with guitar. I wasn't very good at guitar and dropped that off at some point after playing a few of my songs at open mics in town. And so that was when the lyric writing sort of kept going. It wasn't really until college when I took a class that I was like, oh, this is poetry, or a version of
Mhm.
it is poetry.
And then just one more thing about that.
Mhm.
I know you are in Kalamazoo, right? So
Uh,
you're teaching there.
yeah,
Yeah. A little bit about that experience.
yeah. So This is my 2nd year teaching at Kalamazoo College in Michigan, which is just about an hour and a half north of where we are right now. And I'm an assistant professor there. I teach creative writing and poetry. And before that, I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is also where I went to graduate school.
And I saw online you learned to be a librarian there.
I
That's
did.
so
I
fun.
got my MFA in poetry, and then, I had applied to some post-MFA fellowship, and I was a finalist for one, and I didn't get any, and I didn't have any idea what else I was going to do. But during my MFA, I had started working part-time at a library on campus, and I had already kind of been thinking, "Maybe this someday?" Because I had been working with this incredible collection of, like, mostly modernist literary journals, but the collection was still like, had active subscriptions to contemporary journals as well, and it was amazing, it was like having subscriptions to so I thought that was really cool, and I started to get interested in librarianship, and so I just decided at that point to do that sort of right after my MFA. So I did that, and I kept working at the library on campus, and I guess it started kind of as a backup, but I don't mean that as anything about the I mean, it was great, and I think of it as sort of it shapes a lot of the ways that I teach now, and so, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. had never heard of. I guess I just never thought about it. It's like one of those jobs you never really think about you get trained for,
Yeah,
like different things. And like I've been around libraries and librarians my whole life.
yeah, librarians are amazing. Audre Lorde was a librarian.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so we can go to another question. I was thinking we could maybe talk about if there's any like specific models or poets that influence your work at all. Or I know you've talked about before, and I did a little bit of interview research.
Yeah.
Past like professors who
Uh-huh.
I think Lydia Berry or something.
Linda
Linda
Berry.
Berry.
Yep, yep. So, yeah, as far as I think about my influences as a poet as rather eclectic, which I love. And sometimes I get jealous of, if there's a poet that's like, I am of the lineage of this one poet in particular, because it's so clear and it isn't that clear for me. But, I read omnivorously and also deeply. And I feel blessed to have had some really amazing teachers in my life. My first poetry teacher was at the University of Iowa when I was an undergrad, and her name was Caroline Man Ray. She lives in the Finger Lakes region of New York now, teaches there, and she was a graduate student in the Iowa Writers Workshop at the time, and introduced me to Elizabeth Bishop and Scansion and Ammons and Anaphora. I mean, so many of it. I still think back on that class all the time when I'm teaching. And let's see, others at Wisconsin. I mean, Linda taking a workshop with Linda Berry was like a peak pinnacle moment for me. And I took her workshop in the last semester of my MFA in poetry there. And she's not in the creative writing program there, although a lot of writers will take workshops with her. She's got this amazing title that's Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Creativity, which I love. And the workshop that I took with her was about like creativity and the brain. So we all got assigned different parts of the brain names. I was amygdala for the semester. And man, it was amazing. You and I were talking earlier about teaching, outside of our genre. And one thing that was really intimidating for me when I started to teach, actually, and this isn't even genre specific, it was like, you know, the week on imagery, like the week on the image. And I was teaching it, and I was at the same time that I was trying to teach it. What even is this thing? And so taking her workshop where we were like about like memories and imagination, and we were also actually physically drawing a lot. And that just changed everything about the way that I taught the image, the way I think about the image, the way that I work it in my own writing. I was really just seeing it on a spectrum of the literal image that is in a drawing, and also not just the visual, but those details that seem so dumb and are like a portal to an entire like life or an entire part of your life. It's like the smell that like holds the key to something, or so that workshop, it's hard to even put it into words, and it just changed everything, teaching and writing and drawing. And Linda became a really important mentor and friend to me. and I just feel so lucky and blessed to have found my way to that workshop, and all of the faculty at Wisconsin, I don't know what I did to deserve it, but that place was really good to me, and Ahmad Jamal Johnson continues to be a mentor there. Jonathan Senshin, who became a mentor to me in library school and also had kind of come from, like, a literature background into the library school. And yeah, so eclectic influences at times it's just like an individual poem, like there's a Pablo Neruda poem right now that is like my teacher this week. So yeah, comes
Hmm.
from all over.
Yeah, I feel like that shows up a lot because I feel like you experiment lots with different forms and different like movements happening in all of your. Well, I guess with the chapbook, it's mostly the prose poem, but
Yeah.
the other ones, it's very. I don't know. I feel like that shows up, and it's a good amalgamation of things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. But one thing that does come up in all of your writing is nature, of course, but and specifically Midwest landscape, like there's lots of cornfields, farmland, and like specific names that are mentioned, and then they ascribe like a sacredness to the land, to the space around us. And I'm curious if there are other like maybe less overt influences that like nature has on like just like your writing process
Mm,
itself, or how you see your poetry in relation to nature.
yeah, I think this has shifted over the years for me and continues to shift, but I mean, I was telling you like my favorite thing as a kid was like when I would just get to go hang out in the garden alone. And I was a lonely kid, I was a weird kid, I felt very different from, like, most of the other kids around me, and one thing that I really am grateful to my parents for was just we spent a lot of time outside and cultivate like, the outdoor space was, like, an extension of our home. My dad is a very talented and serious birder. And so that sort of like observation, I feel like I got kind of as osmosis growing up. And, I also am prone to anxiety. And when I can remember that just like going outside, like sticking my feet in the dirt or even just like opening a window or something that like brings it back down into the body and like connects in that way. It's a nice thing for me. So there's sort of that element. And then there's also, in advantages of being evergreen, like it was great solace to sort of feel like there were days when it could feel like, oh, like literally no one around me is changing right now, which is of course not true and bogus, but it can just, there's a kind of like awkwardness to it, or at least like having a second puberty when like literally none of your peers are. And so it delighted and comforted me to just feel and cultivate a kind of solidarity with actually the amazing like transformations that are happening all around us all the time. And as I in recent work also, I'm kind of trying to think through a little bit more explicitly the connections between the aesthetics and the ethics just as it relates to a climate crisis
Yeah.
and what like a poem is good for or can do now. So I've been thinking a lot about that and I'm interested not I actually don't think that the only mode or even the most interesting one for that is like elegies to nature because we're not there yet. And so I've been playing around with just how different modes can respond and feel useful right now. So ekphrastic or really just witnessing documentation. That was one of the Pablo Neruda poems right now that I mentioned. And also like instructional poems. Like I think a lot about, poetry of course, was an oral form before it was written and was used a lot for passing on information and instructions and things that you needed to remember. And so, in the sort of pre apocalyptic or like wherever we are in that, I'm kind of like, how can poetry help us now? Right? What is like a poem that I would want to like have memorized, like to go into this unknown future of climate crisis? Or what information? Or, I have so many tabs bookmarked. Like how that's all just like in this like it all feels quite fragile. And so I've been interested about poetry as a way to know a thing by heart going into this unknown future. So yeah, the nature, there's many parts of it, and it's all just I mean, it's like I feel like it's the stew that I'm in and as a poet, but it's evolving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's interesting too, because I feel like it's almost also like a documentation of how it is now before it gets, I mean, it seems like it will get worse.
Right.
Hopefully it won't, but
Right.
so it's almost like preserving in a way.
Yeah, and I find C.A. Conrad so inspiring in this way of, his I feel like his work around this is really what made me first aware of all of the sounds that are disappearing as different species go extinct. And just the the possibilities that creates and also I think responsibilities to be as precise as we can, like to name the specific bird in the poem, like it matters, these things. And I think about what Gertrude Stein said about how it's easy to be ahead of one's time and more challenging to be like exactly in one's time. And so that kind of shapes what I'm like. I'm not interested in like writing elegies to things that are still here, but actually like writing odes to them,
Yeah.
and just still being present with them.
Yeah. I like that. And okay, so we'll change those numbers a little bit.
Uh huh.
Reading your three collections, it's clear that they are all in conversation with each other. There's instances where like lines become titles, and then there's the image of the dancing in a blue dress that happens in the
Mm-hmm.
end. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see them like kind of woven or connected together and within and across your collections.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and also that exact question. I feel like I learned the most about it from other people. And, that's, like, funny how that happens where to you, something can feel either so scattered or like you've just written the same book again, and often I'm so grateful for other people, like, the ways that they see connections or trajectories. It's interesting to have so The Gospel According to X, which just came out, the chapbook, I actually wrote it right after The Spectral Wilderness came out. So it has been maybe 4 years at this point, and Writing Advantages of Being Evergreen, which came out a few months ago, came later, and well, that's fun. Alright.
Okay.
And, I mean, what I mentioned a few minutes ago about trying to get more intentional about the relationship between the aesthetics and the ethics, that's something that's on my mind, and that feels like a marked change from certainly the spectral wilderness, where ethics on a kind of interpersonal level, like relational level, was certainly on my mind as I was writing, but not really wider than that. And with advantages of being evergreen, I felt just sort of thinking in different ways about the communal. And also, started that book really in kind of the immediate week after the 2016 election, which just felt like, I mean, there are certain ways that we can like force or nurture our own trajectory as a writer, and then there are other things that just happen externally.
Yeah.
And really, I mean, the election was the main one, but leading up to that, and my poem in the book Ghost Ship Novena Inside a Year-Long Funeral kind of refers to like this pile up events that was like Pulse Orlando, the ghost ship fire, the election, and all of these things that felt like they were sort of like threat to like safety and creative sanctuaries that my communities and people like my communities had built. So there were just different sort of circumstances on my mind when I wrote that book. And and that is sort of continuing on with the things I'm working on now. I mean, not exactly in the same way, but I feel like I'm writing more in conversation with this climate stuff and with the total, like, just unknown of like where humans are in our lifespan of existence, in our time that we have on this planet. So that I think is a little bit of what my sense is of the trajectory. And when I wrote The Spectral Wilderness, I was so in the thick of really like my first few years of like physical transition with hormones. And I feel at times like I was writing, I mean, I'm so glad I wrote those poems when I did because they're, you know, I, f- I think sometimes that wisdom only accumulates and it doesn't. We totally forget things when we get just further away from them or we're not immediately in it. And so I feel grateful that I wrote that book sort of from that moment
Mm.
because there are things about the immediacy of that transition that I feel like I take for granted now or just don't really have access to anymore. So yeah, I don't know if the trajectory is even, I mean, hopefully there are some things about it that the books can build on, but the books also hold things I feel that I don't really anymore. So
Well, yeah, I feel like that kind of goes back to like, talking about like documenting or preserving nature. It's kind of like
yeah,
the documenting, preserving like bodies and
yeah.
time, but the times our bodies have been in. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, totally.
yeah,
And I mean, gosh, I wish that I had written down every like so much more then, and so all I can do is do that now, even though it's yeah
no,
about different things.
yeah, I know, yeah, because I transitioned as well. It's
Uh
like I
huh.
remember did videos for a while and then I just stopped doing it. So like now I just lost that. So I'm like, it's kind of a similar thing.
Absolutely is. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what can you do?
Yeah. I know. I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at a certain point, I was like, I have to think about other things, and I was grateful for that. Like it needed to. I don't how to be both present for a thing and document it adequately and just show up for the rest of your life. I don't know
Yeah.
that we can do all of that at the same time. And so yeah, it is what it is. But yeah.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to the other, like the Gertrude Stein quote you said of
Right.
you're always ahead of your time, not in the present.
Yeah. That is, yeah, the harder to be like in your time. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially, yeah, with like transition stuff too, because it's just like at least for me, I was like, so I want it to be like 2 years in the future, right
Right.
now. I don't want to go through the
Right.
interim time. So,
Yeah, yeah. This is really, I mean, one thing that I have been interested in recently, both in advantages of being evergreen and in newer work that I'm working on since then, is pleasure and pleasure, the relationship between pleasure and desire, and how to actually be. Because I'm at this point, my second book just came out. I got this tenure track job. A lot of things that were sort of for a while on the horizon
mm,
are now like here or have happened or
yeah,
right. And noticing within myself how quickly things move to, okay, what's next? Right? Tenure in 6 years. Like, what's like the next book? And I've really become interested in like language as a house that I can build to just be inside pleasure without sort of immediately looping to the next desire. So, Brian Tier has a great piece on the Poetry Foundation website called Textual Preference, and it's about the pleasures of reading. That's really great. And Adrienne Marie Brown's new book, Pleasure Activism: The Politics of Feeling Good. Those are a couple things that I've been speaking to and feeding into this for me recently. But yeah.
those that sound good. I'm gonna take note of that.
Yeah, check yeah, for sure.
Okay, and I guess kind of going off of that a little bit, it's clear that like the your work is also in conversation with queer theory and queer histories, either explicitly like this like after Judith Butler or like the histories of different like people and time. But I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about the process of accessing those histories, specifically those that have been poorly or inaccurately documented, or if you or something along those lines.
Gosh, yeah. So, yeah, where to start? I was a women's studies minor in college. It was then women's studies. It is now University of Iowa has since renamed it, as many programs that have, as women, gender, sexuality, or some order of those three words.
Mm,
And so I took feminist theory. I took a class that I don't actually think was in that department on queer media representation. And those courses kind of started to lay some groundwork, but really since then, trying to learn about these histories of what I call my queer side has not been an academic pursuit. One thing that got me interested in librarianship actually was learning about this project in Milwaukee called the Queer Zine Archive Project, where they it's just it's run out of some guy's house maybe, like so many amazing of these things are, and they're collecting, a trove, an archive of queer zines and also digitizing them on this website. And I found that really inspiring. And yeah, just kind of been cobbling pieces of it together since then, watching United in Anger, learning about ACT UP. We have to teach ourselves
Mm,
so many of these things. And really, actually, that's not even quite right. Like teaching each other or learning together. And the Zine Archive project, the Queer Zine Archive project in particular excited me because, I mean, like, the beauty of a zine, right? Anyone can make one. Like, they're all about economy and simplicity. And as a way to publish and circulate, has historically been like a more accessible path. And I feel that so much of queer history must be in zines. And there's others like, Rain Arroyo as a writer who has become really important to me, who I only sort of learned about his work, years after his death. And so that has been like working my way through his poetry and like what I can learn of his life. And I think of him and Linda as I don't know what they occupy sort of just special positions for me. And yeah, the piece that you said about histories that have been sort of underdocumented, I think that, it is a history that has been marked by loss, like almost a complete entire generation of gay men. And, people that are in whether it's like their obituary or a book that is written about their work, sort of put back in the closet. So I try when I teach also just to, I think of Langston Hughes as someone who is not always remembered as like part of the like queer community. So when I teach, I try to just flag these in certain ways so that I mean, all we have is sort of like these little signals that we give each other into the future of the queer was here. And so I think there's like kind of a responsibility to just make that visible as much as possible
mhm.
because I don't think anyone else is going to do it for us.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like my syllabus this semester is almost all I'm teaching almost all queer people.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Actually,
do you tell your students that, or do you just let the work stand on its own? Like, how I do it both ways sometimes, depending on.
yeah, I mean with some it was obvious. Like I taught the anthology, the Nepentland anthology of
Uh-huh,
queer poets and
uh-huh,
poetry.
yeah,
So like that one was obvious, and
yeah,
then
yeah,
other ones wasn't so obvious. But
right,
like, yeah, someone actually complained about my syllabus. So what can you do? So, but yeah, you're right.
yeah,
No one's gonna. It always falls on the minority person or like whatever to do the teaching and to it becomes a responsibility.
yeah,
It's not right.
yeah,
But
and what I find so amazing also is, like, queerness, as far as we know, isn't passed on genetically, and yet it finds its way into the future, into the present in these most amazing ways. Like it is just here every single time and is not something that like in most cases someone, gets from their parents. And I love that about it. I think it is so miraculous and beautiful. Maybe that's off the topic. I don't know.
I mean, that's great.
Apropos of everything, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess this is also kind of related. So I want to also talk about pronouns,
Uh-huh.
like throughout all of your work,
Uh-huh.
because I really resonated with like the me, him, he versus the she, her, like as
Uh-huh.
a trans dialogue of like past self
Uh-huh.
or something like that. Like,
Uh-huh.
but then there's also other instances where it's like it seems fairly clear that it's another person,
Uh-huh.
like a partner or something. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe like the intention there, like the ambiguity maybe there between the
Yeah.
or if maybe I read it wrong, I don't know.
No, I mean, you're not the first person who has picked up on that ambiguity. And as for intention, I'd rather not lie and say that it was intentional. Let me peel back some of those double negatives. I'm not sure that it was intentional, and yet you're right that it's there. And partly, there are poems that are sort of drawing from like an externalized relational pronouns. And then In other places, that's referring sort of to parts of self or pieces of self throughout history. And I'm totally fine and interested in what happens with those two sort of contexts rubbing up against one another. And to me, I it's not important that, a reader knows when the she is someone else and when it's,
Yeah.
sort of getting at something about the historical description or remembrance of self. And I think also, there's we do try to find, I think, pieces of ourselves in others, sometimes in generative ways and other times in, subconscious or projection
Yeah.
ways. And so I feel like that ambiguity, it makes sense. There's truth to it. And it isn't really something that I did intentionally. Although I think in Field Guide, the first poem of Advantages of Being Evergreen, there were ways that I was intentional about the kind of the anaphora, the repeated elements
Yeah.
throughout the poem I kind of knew that I was cultivating that
Yeah.
ambiguity. So that poem stands out in that. And with X, in the Gospel according to X, X started out as a placeholder for what I thought would later become a name.
Mm.
And then it became very clear to me that, the placeholder was sort of the point, like
Yeah.
this gesture of a sort of ambiguous symbol, piece of a formula that holds space that can become something else that maybe isn't yet, but also already is. And that too is just, yeah, something that I picked up in Linda Berry's workshop where we were, writing exercises of just like using X as a way as a placeholder for maintaining speed while writing
Mm.
with the intention of coming back to it later. And I just didn't in that
Mhm.
project. And I just realized at some point that it was just X. Yeah.
That's so interesting. When I first read it, I was thinking of like, 'cause now in some states you can get X as like your gender marker on your ID.
Yeah. I
And
don't
so
even think I was aware of that at the
uh,
time. But
well, I don't know if it was written so soon after Spectral
I
Witness. I
think
don't know if that was a thing then.
yeah, maybe it was just starting to become a thing, but it certainly wasn't on my radar. But I mean, it's funny I mean it makes sense, right? But yeah, why X as like this queer letter? I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't
Yeah.
know.
You said something I was gonna say something and I totally forgot. But it was about tension with the pronouns. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Okay, sure. X.
X, yeah. Um, okay. So I also want to talk about home and the concept of home and like throughout history, like I feel like home is it's complicated enough as it is just everyday, everyday people. But I feel like with specifically with queer people, I think it's always like a loaded term, and I just wanted to talk about how, like, in a lot of the times the speakers in your poem, like, mourning a loss of, like, familiarity and a loss of home and while also creating space. And I was wondering if you view home as a place that exists already or a place that, like, we have to create for ourselves, and maybe even within ourselves, or talk about home.
Yeah, great question. I do still think of Iowa as a kind of home, but maybe a little bit in the way that like you misremember a song,
Yeah.
but then the version that you misremember it as also becomes true,
Yeah.
kind of. Like when I think of Iowa as home, I don't know that there's a physical place really that matches that I could go back to. My parents have since moved, other relatives have passed and are underground there. I do still have some in Iowa, and it has been nice to go back and spend time with them there. But, I think it is particular for queer people. And I mean, we know that it is. We know that vastly disproportionate amounts of youth experiencing homelessness are from the LGBT community. Going back to, what I mentioned about queer and trans experience most often being something that is not shared with someone's, family that they were raised with. And so, kids getting like rejected by their families, kicked out of their homes. So, you can go as far as like the basic needs. I've been spending a lot of time recently looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And they say that you can go 3 hours without shelter, which might sound like you could go way longer than that, but when you picture, like, a snowstorm or 120-degree heat or whatever, all of these extremes that are becoming more common with climate change. So this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, just shelter and queer people and how, for me, it has been this sort of, it's a bit, there's like wonderings about home or longings for home, chosen family, trying to cultivate what this is as an adult. And just as like I was mentioning, I feel like I like have these things now that were on the horizon for me for a while. And I'm trying to figure out how to show up more for people for whom home isn't really like, this like a metaphorical question in the ways that I feel like I get to wonder about it today,
Mm,
but is like something much more like immediate. There's these great guides now online that are geared toward helping shelters transition from like sort of not doing anything special geared toward being LGBTQ friendly to like really knowing what the particular needs are and accommodating them. So I feel inspired by that, and I feel like hopefully things are moving in a good direction. But
yeah.
yeah.
We kind of already talked about this with a little bit of nature, and then also talking about like transformations, and I think with that. But
Yeah.
so I'll just yeah. So nature, specifically the volatile ways in which she grows and transforms in order to survive, is prevalent throughout all your work that I've read. The speaker in the Spectral Wilderness at one point says, "I farm not for the countryside, but for the tumbling sense inside me that everything has to transform eventually." With these thoughts in mind, how do you see these transformations as creating spaces within which the queer body can both live and survive, which is kind of also touches on what we were just talking about. But
Can you say that one more time?
sorry,
That's okay.
how do you see these transformations as creating space or spaces within which the queer body can both live and survive? Like the transformations of nature and stuff. Maybe I'm not
Well,
being clear
no,
enough.
no, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, I'll just say some things and you can let me know afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, adaptation is a lot of what was on my mind with advantages of being evergreen. And also, this question of going back to, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which has the physiological needs on the bottom, food, water, shelter, air. And then all the way at the top is like art and self-expression. And my partner actually was just telling me that those what was it? It was like debunked is maybe a strong word, but it's a false idea that one moves through those linearly as though art only becomes important like after all of these things, right? When for me it's like there's this matrix of needs sort of happening all at once. And I'm not saying that I would die in 3 minutes or 3 hours without poetry, but 3 weeks would be pushing it. And so when I think about adaptation, I feel excited about the our planet is obviously changing. And I feel like that only presses up against what are already urgent needs. And I think at the same time that surviving is important and great and hard work many days. And also, who doesn't want to thrive on top of that? And so, a lot of what I was thinking about with advantages of being evergreen was sort of these like slices of like pleasure and paradise and beauty alongside everything else, alongside like navigating threats and dangers. And it's a kind of line being walked between what I feel like is an important sense of belonging with the earth, like the earth, especially for people who have been made to feel like we don't belong everywhere, or if we have been alienated from our families, like, where did we come from? Who did we belong to? Right? So I think it can be very powerful to say we belong to the earth, right? We are here and it is our home just as much as it is for anyone else. And at the same time, it seems like it's that exact attitude from humans that have sort of gotten us to this place of just, I know that's really different from this sort of extractive sense of entitlement that has precipitated this human impact on the climate. And at the same time, it's a little crunchy there. And it's like a question that I'm interested in my work. Does that make
No,
sense?
totally.
Okay.
Yeah. I've actually never thought about that like that because I feel as like personally, but then also like with like when I read your work too, like
Uh-huh.
the of like this connection of to nature and to that we all the same particles, like
Uh-huh.
we're all mixed up at one point.
Right, right.
But thinking about that's what got us in this mess in the first place. That's
Yeah.
so
Or maybe it's the difference between, the feeling like I belong to the earth versus like it belongs
yeah.
to me.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's actually funny. Okay, so when I originally wrote that question, I had live and thrive, but then I read an interview that you were in with Papa Akbar a couple years ago,
Uh-huh.
and you said, "I've been trying to think of a word that I hate less than thrive." I'm still searching for a better word to
Oh.
describe going beyond surviving.
Oh, that's funny.
And so now I'm curious if you still feel the same, or if you found a word that's better, or it's just totally
Hmm.
like not even on your mind anymore. So,
Well, that's funny. Thank you for reminding me of that. I do not feel a strong aversion to thrive currently. But I think what I was saying about pleasure has taken some of the place
mm,
of that, like acknowledging its role as something important that keeps us going and that we can't just work all the time. There has to be pleasure and it can be part of the work. We can't just organize all the time. There has to be pleasure and it can be part of the organizing. So, yeah, I think I would locate some of it there now. And I also, yeah, I think the way that I apparently felt about Thrive in the Dive Dabber interview, I would locate it back now with the word tolerate. That one to me is it's not enough. When I read about, ways organizations are trying to become more tolerant or how to show that you're tolerant, I'm just like, yeah, that one is insufficient for me. We tolerate things that ultimately are still unpleasant and that we
mhm,
wish we didn't have to. And so, yeah, I'm much more interested in places becoming affirming or, any other sort of number of these things. So I'd like to move my aversion to the word tolerance
okay.
in this interview for some interviewer in the future to check back with me on.
That's so funny. Cycle. Yeah. So it's kind of going off in a different direction. I tried to look online to
Uh-huh.
find information about this. I couldn't really find a whole lot, but I know that you read at the trans community briefing in the White House in 2016,
I
and I was
did.
wondering if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, about that, how that was experience, because that was Obama was still in
Yep.
office, but then it was
Just barely.
just
Yeah.
after the
Yep.
election. So
Yeah.
it must have
That's
been an
right.
interesting time to be there.
Yeah. I mean, it was a then annual trans community briefing. It was annual at the time and like definitely has not happened since then. And briefing, I'm not sure how many other briefings at the White House look like this because it was more like how to describe it? A celebration,
Mhm.
a variety show, a salon. I mean, it was just kind of like an amazing cross section of 60 or so presenters talking about their work, or I read a few poems. Some people were talking about their activism. There were other poets. I don't even remember what else. It was a beautiful, just sort of like conglomeration of things, mostly trans people of color. And I almost didn't go. And I didn't realize that until just now when you asked me about it. I totally almost didn't go. And I remember talking to a friend who was like, you should definitely go to that. You should definitely go. And I don't know why. It was something that seemed so all consuming at the time. Like, I was nervous, you
Yeah,
know? I
I
think
mean,
I was,
yeah.
like, quite nervous, and it was, like, a big deal. I'm pretty sure I wore a tie, and, like, we had to go through the whole sort of elaborate security process to get in, which was actually a process that started weeks before that, where, like, I had to send the text ahead of time of poems that I planned to
Oh, wow.
read, and I'm pretty sure there was, like, a background check weeks ahead of time, so it was I almost didn't go. I think I just kind of psyched myself out, or I don't know, I mean, it felt I don't even remember. I don't even remember why, but I'm really glad I did.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel that must have been, I don't know, so wild to be in the White House and then just be celebrating that. That would be great.
It was a good
But
time.
yeah, but I feel like with that kind of stuff, it's maybe sometimes it's like the things you're most apprehensive about because you're apprehensive. Maybe the fact that it turns out so well or that it goes well, it makes like the contrast makes it into something. I mean, not saying that it wouldn't have already been like something great, but
Yeah, absolutely, and I think, I feel like it does work that way, and it's, I think, harder to see it work that things work that way in my own life, and easy for me to see. For example, with my students, it is often, like, when they are on the edge of something amazing that, like, they'll get freaked out or wanna put down a particular draft or, anything like that, and so I hope that we all just keep going.
mm,
It's a particular kind of intuition that I think can sometimes, there's other kinds of intuition when you feel like freaked out about something that it's, yeah, don't do that.
yeah,
Don't
yeah,
do that. But there is a particular kind that's this is an amazing opportunity, or I'm really close to some kind of like breakthrough or something amazing, and I totally want to walk away from it.
yeah.
And yeah, I hope hopefully I get better through at recognizing that, but I don't. It's kind of
Yeah.
ongoing.
Well, yeah, I feel like I get that sometimes. I feel like with probably lots of writers, where it's especially if you're writing about something that's like hard to write about or traumatic. It's I know that writing it, I'll feel better and it'll get it out. But then the process of getting there is so hard. So
Yeah, and I have read, several interviews recently, or even just writers, posting on Twitter who have had memoirs come out recently. Saeed Jones, one I can think of, who described the process as terrible. Like, not sort of pleasurably cathartic at all, but actually, like, quite awful.
Mm,
And I've been kind of interested in that.
yeah,
And I think, have people, like, always felt that way about writing memoirs and just haven't said so?
yeah,
Or yeah, I don't know. That's totally a tangent, but I found it interesting.
yeah. Well, I'm out of my printed questions, but I think we still have some time. We can spend more time just talking about your chapbook.
Sure.
I mean, it's obviously called the Gospel according to Acts, so
Yeah.
gospel has religious connotations,
Yeah.
but then maybe I just maybe was wondering if you could talk more about that process and like the way you use like spirituality in this chapbook.
Yeah.
It's kind of a big question. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, it's fine. I was actually thinking about this on my drive down here. I went to Catholic school from 2nd to 8th grade, and I was not Catholic. I mean, my mom was raised Catholic, but we didn't go to a parish in town. And so my experience at Catholic school was I was one of the 4 kids at the school who wasn't Catholic, so I kind of like in it, but also observing it.
Mm,
And so, I think it was once a week, they would bring in 4 priests, one from each parish in town, and each one would set up in a different corner of the gymnasium. And the entire school population would go to the gymnasium. And all of my friends would be like lining up for like their priest to, do their weekly confession. And me and like these 3 other kids would just be sitting on the bleachers, like talking. And so which just seemed normal at the time, and now when I think about it, I was like, "It's kind of odd." It's a little odd. I mean, I don't know what else we would have done during that time. There were so few of us who weren't, like, going through the active confession, but so I feel like, I was sort of, like, during what was an impressionable time, this kind of, like, act of confession, the impulse toward it, and then the act. It was just, like, in there, and it's something that I've carried with me, and that also kind of had a layer added onto it where I feel that, queer and trans people, there is this whole thing about, like, coming out. It can I mean, it can be amazing, of course, and also at times it is something that is owed to other people or, trans people experience violence for not, like, disclosing their trans status to a potential date soon enough, like, soon enough according to who.
Yep.
So, these things around confession, and there's a few lines in there that are kind of about that in particular, but I was also interested, I felt really prepared for, like, the physical aspects of transition. Very prepared. Like, I had got, like, handouts from my doctor, and read, like, everything that I could on the internet, and for the more spiritual aspects of it, I felt very unprepared, and in a way that was sort of like, it kind of freaked me out, because I do think it is holy and beautiful, and in part was just kind of trying to write the type of thing that I wished that I could read about it. And I think, confession, prayer, there's the impulse of them, there's the act of them, there's also, is there someone on the other side of it? And I transition to me too seems like an act of faith, like something that you might not know exactly how it is going to work out, but it's still important to you to do it. And like you believe that it matters. And so all of those things were just sort of blurring together for me at this particular point, which was still somewhat early in my transition. And the particular relationship that I had been writing about in the spectral wilderness with these questions of sort of like how much change can love handle had, been answered in kind of particular ways. And so it was a hard time and all of these things were kind of kicking around. And I wrote that and I drafted that in one weekend. It was a very intense weekend. And I was living in a house that I now in retrospect understand was like totally a haunted house. It had this blocked off attic and was right on some train tracks. But at the time I was like, oh, this is like a cute rental bungalow. But I felt that I was the one who was haunted also. And I don't know to what extent that comes through in there. But yeah, so all of these kinds of things of just like kind of navigating the becoming and integrating and walking with total fear about actually is this all at the expense of a life that will be alone. So
Yeah. Wow. That's serious though. Yeah.
so it's very like it's deeply meaningful to me. At a certain point I wasn't sure whether it would be published anywhere. I at first I had it sort of bundled just as like a section with some other poems and I was thinking of it as an actual book length manuscript. And I had sent that out a few places. It was a finalist at Nightboat who had
Nice.
said, "We love this, but it's not done. It's not like in its final form." And they were right. They were totally right. And over the next few years, I had it just in the drawer for a while, and then I ultimately just stripped everything out of all the other poems that I had in there aside from this. So it's kind of wild to me to see it in person now. I just got the boxes this past week, and yeah, it's a trip.
Yeah. It's actually funny that you said that it was a haunted house because there's the home in here that's
Yeah,
my
that
body
was
is the
one
haunted
that I
house.
had originally had
In there?
in the full length with this.
Oh,
That's the only one, I think, of those that I pulled forward from that, and I put it in here. Yeah, yeah.
was that inspired by that house you lived in? Or do you think it was
Yes, it wasn't so specific to that, but that was certainly part of it. Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, everything that I just described, yeah, totally.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that, like, when you were writing this Adventures of Being Evergreen, you were thinking more of, like, pleasure and, like, community and yeah, just being together. I was
Yeah,
wondering if you wanted to talk about that a little bit or
yeah, I think I am learning the older I get that there is really kind of so little that we have to do alone. And I feel like I have gotten really used to, I mentioned like I was a lonely kid. Like I was to a certain extent, it was just like life is lonely. And it is a little bit, but it also totally isn't. It doesn't have to be. And there's ways to make it that are much more together than I think like the modern world has designed it, Don't really feel like we're supposed to live alone. And I've lived alone before and it felt great at the time, and also terrible. So I'm just becoming more interested in people and what we can do for each other, what we can do together, what we owe each other, and just that life to me is better that way. And I think particularly in that time of like right after the election it was, like, critical for me to just remember that even though I felt very alone and freaked out, like, I wasn't, it didn't have to be. And so, particularly the poem in the River I Dream About is really, to me, like, the one where I'm like, "Oh, finally, everyone that I love is in one place." 'Cause, also, I feel like my heart is just sort of scattered everywhere, and these people that, you know, are really dear to me and just live in many different places at this point. And so, at least in that poem, I feel like everyone is there, and it's really nice.
So beautiful. So I feel like there was another thing I was gonna ask and I just forgot it again. I can't tell what time it is. Do you know what time it is?
4:27,
Oh.
if I'm reading that right.
So I mean, we're pretty much close there. Was there anything maybe else that you wanted to talk about at all with in relation to your work or
I don't think so. Your questions were great. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, and I can't think of anything else that I would want to bring up. So just, yeah, it's been really nice to talk with
yeah.
you more. And I was a little nervous going into
Oh, me
this.
too. I specifically wore a shirt that you couldn't tell any sweat was happening.
Yeah, no, just thanks.
Thank
Just
you.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
so much for being part of this
yeah.